China and the United States face off in Djibouti. A dirt track at Djibouti's Darali port leads to a series of unassuming single-story buildings that, earlier this year, hosted the world's two superpowers. The Chinese contingent took their seats to the far right of the podium, where U.S. Rear Admiral Heidi Berg, Cutlass, and the handful of other annual U.S.-led drills held throughout the African continent, are a low-risk and relatively low-cost way for U.S. Africa Command (AFRICOM) to gain and keep regional allies. But in Djibouti, a key Red Sea ally of the U.S., and throughout Africa, there's new competition for local loyalties from China's military, which is increasingly asserting its influence on the continent. In 2017, China's People Liberation Army (PLA) opened its first overseas base in Djibouti. The sprawling Le Monnier is a strategic asset for U.S. missions abroad, used as a staging area for America's intelligence and counterterrorism operations on the African continent and beyond. One AFRI. On the ground, however, both sides are engaged in respectful diplomacy. The night before the cut, when Berg was asked to comment on the The Chinese contingent at the Cutlass Express launch declined to comment to CNN, but President Xi Jinping made it clear at a high-level summit in Beijing last September that he's pursuing a comprehensive China has been expanding its military ties in Africa for years, through extended peacekeeping missions, military personnel training and the China-Africa Peace and Security Initiative Forum. Chinese foreign The U.S., naturally, viewed the base with unease, given its proximity to Camp Le Monnier and Djibouti's main container port, which is the primary source of supplies to sustain a force of around 4,000 U.S. personnel on the base. The loss of that access would be a devastating blow to American interests and operations. One way that could, perhaps. She said the Chinese base has riled the U.S. because of a growing rhetoric of fear. In recent years, China has increased its decades-long military ties with African countries by expanding training programs and increasing weapon sales. It's now the number, but at the heart of the U.S. concern is China's lending practices on the continent. Since 2000, last year, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton was blunt. During a heritage fest, but Bolton's rhetoric only makes combating the perceived threat more difficult, said Collins. When the U.S. fears about losing access to the port could be rooted in history. In 2007, in that instance, the Sri Lankan government, then led by Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, took on $1.5 billion of Chinese debt to develop the Hambantota port, which ultimately failed. To ease its debt burden, proponents of China's BRI point out that the scheme often funds much-needed projects that other investors would balk at supporting, and that its focus on infrastructure, with a target investment of $1 trillion in construction, is having an immediate impact on the continent. China's foreign ministry has stated repeatedly that its investments in Africa come with no political strings attached, and it has repeatedly denied China is engaging in what's been referred to as debt. Djiboutian officials insist the country will maintain control over its ports and that, so far, the government has a solid track record of paying off its loans. But Hadi is also well aware of the risks of literally banking on China. He just returned. Hadi bristles at the notion that his country and others on the continent are caught in a superpower tug of war. The official position of the Djibouti government may do little to reassure skeptics who believe China's investment program is a front for a more sinister motive of establishing a military footprint worldwide. Countering China's economic might is hardly something that should fall on AFRICOM, said Wake Forest professor Ben Abdallah. China Bin Abdallah added that much of China's expansion in Africa is the result of strategic dedication led by XI. The Chinese President Collins, founder of China Signpost, said soft power has long been a distinguishing feature of U.S. foreign policy, and the current administration would be best served by taking a multilateral approach to relations in Africa. 4. It's. But until the U.S. can figure out an all. We.
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park,